2008 and Server 2012. I am a Microsoft certified trainer, and I am the president of the Indianapolis PowerShell user group. You'll see that I've got my contact information listed up there. The main one I want to point out is my blog, mattblogsit.com. I will be posting these slides for this presentation and then also the presentation that I'm doing directly after this based on SharePoint to that blog. I also have my Twitter handle up there. I don't tweet too much, but I am on there occasionally. And my email address. If there's any questions you forget to ask during the session or anything that comes up in your actual work experience, I strongly encourage anyone to reach out to me. I really enjoy helping people as much as my time allows. So definitely feel free to reach out to me at any time. The first thing we're going to be talking about are, well, first off, what we're talking about today. And that's going to be what is PowerCLI, PowerCLI commandlets versus using views, which we'll get into that in a little bit more depth later. And auditing your VMware environment, and finally reporting VM level performance using PowerCLI. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what is PowerCLI. According to VMware, it's going to be your command line and scripting tool that is built using PowerShell. It's providing 400 commandlets for managing and maintaining your vSphere or vCloud environments. In reality, what PowerCLI really is a set of snap-ins for PowerShell. And then also this little pretty PowerShell profile that changes your default colors and a couple of things such as that. Overall, the snap-ins vary on exactly what they have to do, but you'll kind of dive into that more with the different specific commandlets. The first thing I really want to talk about is going to be what is PowerCLI and what is PowerCLI for tenants. The first thing is PowerCLI is going to be used with your on-premise vCenter environment. This is going to be what you automatically install when you consider yourself installing PowerCLI. The other one, which is an optional feature, is going to be your PowerCLI for tenants. The key difference with PowerCLI for tenants is that it is going to actually be used if you're working in a vCloud environment, if you're using a public cloud provider. A big one I work with outside of within Indiana is BlueLock. They use VMware vCloud as their platform, so I can actually interact with that public cloud environment using PowerCLI for tenants. The commandlets are a little bit different, and the main difference between them is that the noun of the commandlet, which all PowerShell commandlets, verb-noun or verb-like-noun, is going to be starting with your CI prefix. So you'll have something like get-CI-VM, which if you're working with PowerCLI, it's going to be get-VM. So the main thing we're going to kind of dive into here is, and this is going to be the big kind of topic that we talk about today, is going to be using PowerCLI commandlets that are available just out of the box versus using the views and actually interacting more at the API level with PowerCLI. So when we're talking about that, the first thing we're going to be talking about is, well, what's the difference between all of the Git commandlets that are available? Because the main thing we'll talk about today is going to be auditing and just gathering information, not changing things in PowerCLI, is going to be using Git commandlets. There's 127 different commandlets that start with Git that are part of the PowerCLI snap-ins. Now, that includes the PowerCLI for tenant snap-ins, which we'll look at here in a little bit also. Then you have the git-view commandlet, which is also one of those Git commandlets when you're working with PowerCLI. You use the view type parameter to work with managed objects at the API level. And there's 15 different supported managed objects from PowerCLI. And here are some of the ones that are, or here are all of the 15 different supported managed objects. Now there are more managed objects with PowerCLI. These are the 15 ones that are supported by PowerCLI in its current state. You're going to see that some of the main ones, you can work with any of these. The main ones I find myself working with most include the data center, the data store, the host system, the network, the virtual app, and the virtual machine. The virtual machine being the main one I work with most. There's also the host system is another one that we'll actually explore a little bit today in the demonstrations. If you really want to read about all of these, the different properties and members of these managed objects, I've provided a link there in the PowerPoint. Like I said, I'll post this later today on my blog. And that link is going to send you directly to the VMware, their reference guide, their API reference guide. And it is as exhilarating of a read as TechNet is. And same thing with MSDN, super exciting. It's got fantastic information in it. but I know we are all technical people and we all do enjoy a good technical read, but you can only read about APIs and managed objects and properties and members of those properties so much. So we'll actually talk about other ways to kind of explore what API is available today. So we just talked a little bit about PowerCLI, but let's talk about PowerCLI for tenants. If you're doing the git-ci commandlets, there's only 11 of those. So it's a lot more reduced, and there's good reason for that. You're not managing near as much when you're using PowerCLI for tenants. You're using a public cloud offering. And with that public cloud offering, you don't need to manage as much, since it is supposed to be, for the most part, the infrastructure is managed for you, except for small little details that you take care of. Now, there's also a search cloud command. This is not exactly the same as git view, but it is very similar in that it's going to help you out, and you should use search cloud more than you should use git-ci. And this has actually 75 different supported objects. Now, unless you are the actual administrator for the vCloud environment, then you're only going to use about 16 of them. In all reality, it's probably even fewer than that. So you'll see that some of those managed objects range from user or VM. There's also catalog and media, your event, VApp network, and task is probably one of my favorite kind of hidden jewels that's within that. And the reason the task is kind of a really handy one is because let's say you have 5 different administrators for your vCloud, your public cloud offering. Well, you don't know what they're doing, and maybe you had 5 VMs just randomly go offline. No idea what happened. Did they crash? What's going on? Well, that task one, you can actually look and see who initiated what tasks and what they actually did. So if someone accidentally hit that big red button on your VApp and it shuts down every single VM within that VApp, you're going to see that they initiated a shutdown of all those VMs. And you can see that using that task manage object. So let's talk a little bit about the syntax specific to your using views or using search cloud. Well, you can run git VM. What that's going to do, it's going to give you every single VM in your environment with some very high-level details with PowerCLI. Or if you want to do something with git view, it's going to look like that beautiful single line of text. That is all one line of PowerShell. It's all in the same pipeline, and it's a lot messier. Do not freak out. It is not that bad. The key things you need to know in this is that you've got the git view, and you're specifying the view type of virtual machine. I'm also performing a filter because I don't want to see the VM templates in this one. And so I'm filtering that out. The furthest to the left is where you always want to apply your filters when you're looking through information. And then I'm also specifying the property parameter and selecting specific properties. That is the real key things that you need to run at a minimum to get this information using git cloud or git view. And technically you don't have to include the property one, but the reason we include that is because the less information you gather, the less processing is required, and that is where the real time saving comes in at that we'll talk about here soon. The next one is git-ci VM. With git-ci VM, it's going to do the same thing, except for this one's going to be with your public cloud VMs. Your vCloud VMs that is managed, or the infrastructure is managed by someone else. You just manage the VMs. Now, this is a little bit more manageable using the search cloud commandlet. Again, the main things, you're going to use the query type parameter to specify which managed object you want to pull. And then the properties, again, you want to specify every single property because the less information you pull back, the easier and faster it is to process. Now I talked about how faster it is to process. Let's actually look at some real numbers I ran in my lab environment at home. I have a single ESXi host running with a vCenter server running, and I have 9 VMs in that environment and 2 templates. When I ran git-vm, it took 12.9 seconds, which might not seem extremely long, but when you're staring at a little thing just blinking, it takes forever for 12.9 seconds to pass. When I used the equivalent of that git-view, it took 10.5 seconds. And you're probably thinking, okay, whoop-de-doo, 2 seconds. Not that big a deal. Well, that is 21% faster, and the key thing to note is this is only 9 VMs and 2 templates. Imagine if that was 200 VMs or 300 VMs. Depending on the size of your environment, you could have massive time savings by using the git view. And if you're talking at enterprise level, you're not going to be able to get anything truly accomplished without using git view. You could potentially be looking at running 10 minutes, 15 minutes, even an hour, depending on how many VMs you have in your environment. And yeah, 21% faster might not seem like a lot, but when you start talking about an hour, it starts to become a significant amount of time. The same thing with git VM host. This is going to return my physical hosts that are part of this part of my VMware environment. And when I run git-vm host, it took me only about 5.3 seconds. That was running with one physical host, and it's not any kind of amazing host that's in that environment, but it's an ESX host nonetheless. When I used the view to get the exact same information that git-vm host returns by default, it only took me 344 milliseconds. So we're talking about 0.35 seconds to run. Now that is drastic time savings, 175% time savings. So again, you really want to use the different views and managed objects to actually gather this information. And the same thing with git CI/VM. When I used the search cloud commandlet, it took 88% less time to actually complete. And the vCloud environment had 21 VMs in it. Now, you might not have as many VMs in your vCloud environment. You might have even more. Clients I've worked with, I've had one client that had, I think it was about 70 VMs in a vCloud environment. And so this would have been drastic time savings by using the search cloud instead of git-CI/VM. So let's actually talk a little about how you want to audit your VMware environment. So what are some of the things that you guys would want to audit in your VM environment?
Snapshots.
Very good one. What else? Your physical ESX hosts, your virtual machines, data store utilization. There's a lot of things you can audit. In this, I've got virtual machines. I've got old snapshots. That's a big one. That's going to be a major pain point for any VM admin. Simply because if you've got a snapshot that's a couple weeks old or a couple months old, depending on the change on that system, you can run out of space on your data store really fast. And when that happens, it's going to be a bad day. Trying to bring that back online is a very challenging process to try to delete things. And then physical host specs. Maybe you want to know how much memory do I have on my physical host, how much CPU I have. What are some of the things in PowerCLI for tenants you might want? I guess my real question, is anyone in here using a vCloud provider for their environment, or is everyone on-premise? Everyone's on-premise? Okay. So some of the things you might want to look at, again, virtual machines, users and permissions. And then also different actions that have been taken. Like I said, that task manage object is really handy. So the good news for everyone, since everyone's on-premise or your own private cloud, you can consider it, is we're going to look at auditing physical hosts in this actual demonstration. So when you want to actually start figuring out how do I want to audit this, the first step is we got to actually figure out what we're trying to gather. When you are doing any kind of actual development, or even when you're doing consulting for a client, the one thing that is always overlooked, what do you guys actually want? Is what you need to know is you need to have that set of guidelines of this is all of the information that we want to gather. You need to also identify what managed object you're going to be working with. You need to discover where those properties exist, which that'll partially be done with step 2, but maybe not all of them were identified. And then you need to write your PowerShell script. So let's jump into step number 1 and let's do some performance gathering. What is essential when we are trying to audit our physical host? What are some of the things that you absolutely need to know?
CPU and RAM.
CPU and RAM. What else?
Networking.
Network adapters, something like that. Yeah. Anything else? What about the name of the system? Number of CPUs, total memory. You can do many other things like the networking, maybe number of physical CPUs versus number of CPU cores. So what would be some of the nice to have things? Not absolutely essential, but it would be really cool to have.
Version info.
Version info, that's a good one. What else?
What data stores?
Data stores it's connected to? I'm very particular. I want to see my memory in gigabytes. It could be in bytes, and I don't want to see something in bytes. It could be in megabytes. I still don't want to see it. If we have 127 or 128 gigs of memory, I don't want to see that in megabytes. I want to see that in gigabytes. The total CPU processing in gigahertz. And then, how do you want to see this information? Do you want this to just be plopped out to the console? Do you want it to go to a text document? Most cases, I like to see it in a spreadsheet. So in a CSV, so I can export it to a CSV, very simple with PowerShell. And then I will send that to my manager, like, oh, look at this pretty report I threw together for you guys, even though it only took me about 5 minutes. It's got all these machines and all these pretty statistics about our environment. So let's actually jump in and talk about how we can identify those managed objects. Well, you can look at that API reference guide. Like I said, that is an exhilarating read. It does have fantastic information in it, but I would be going through coffee nonstop when I'm browsing through all that text. So my personal favorite is I'm just going to start exploring it using PowerShell. And so I'm going to assign that get view commandlet to a variable, so I don't have to query the information. I can try and just browse around it, no problem. And then I'll check for the necessary properties using the get member commandlet. And then you go through discovering the properties. We've got an option 2. If you performed option 2, you're going to have most of that information already available to you because you've browsed through and seen where that information exists. And remember, get member is going to be your best friend. So let's actually jump in and let's do a demonstration here. We will see how well this actually comes up on my screen because I've got to we're going to duplicate here. Now this is going to my home network, so if connection drops, I apologize, I do have a backup plan. I'm going off my cell phone, so hopefully we'll be alright. Of course, it's taking a little bit of time to connect. There we go. So you'll see that I've already opened up PowerCLI. You can see my pretty star background. It all rotates through a bunch of different space and Earth pictures. And what I have is I've already loaded up my console here. You're going to see it's loaded up the PowerCLI profile. It gives you a little bit of information like, oh, well, you need to connect to a host. You need to run connect-vi server. And there you go, nice little mountain background now. So let's go ahead and let's run connect-vi server. Now I'm going to just tab complete that. And the server name is going to be Griffin-vCenter. And then I need to specify the credentials to connect to it. I'm going to actually use a parenthetical command to go ahead and just get the credential. And when I run that, it's going to prompt up and say, hey, we need your login information. And that login information is going to be administrator. If I can type. And vsphere.local. And my password, if I can remember it. There we go. And what it's going to do is you're going to see a whole lot of red or yellow text here. And this yellow text is going to say, hey, you're not using a valid certificate. And it's because this is a home lab environment. I wasn't going to purchase a certificate. So it's using self-sign. And then you'll see that it's actually connected to the vCenter server. It says which server it's connected to, on which port, and what user I'm connected as. So the next thing I want to do is I need to go ahead and I could run git-vm host. And you're going to see, like I said, that 5 seconds doesn't seem very long, but when you're waiting at a console. Actually, can you guys see that text all right? Do I need to make it bigger? Is it good?
A little bigger.
A little bit bigger? We'll go ahead and change that then. Okay, that's weird. Okay, is that better? Okay. So now that I've ran that, you're going to see it provide me a little bit of information. The name, I joined this system using the IP address instead of an actual DNS name. That's why it has an IP address there. That's the name of this ESX host. It's connected to it, it's powered on, the number of CPUs. It's showing my CPU usage in megahertz and then the total CPU in megahertz because it's adding the CPU usage and then the total CPU available. So let's try to make this a little bit prettier. So I'm going to actually assign to the phost variable the get view, and I'm going to use the view type of the view type. Tab complete a little too soon of host system. And again, it's going to take a little bit of time to run. What it's doing is it's gathering all that information. So now I can run phost, and you'll see there's a lot of information here. When you look through this, you're actually going to see a lot of these properties are actually objects within them. So runtime is actually the host runtime info property. Host list summary. There's a lot of information in here, but what we're really looking for is things like the name of the system, the total CPU, the total memory. Is it connected? Is it powered off? Basically, what the commandlet returned right here. So let's go ahead and let's browse through this a little bit deeper. Considering we can start at the top, I'm going to look at summary, since I think that it'll have a good summary of the information of this host. So I'm going to go ahead and run the phost commandlet, and we're going to specify summary. And now when we look at this property, we're going to see that it contains hardware, runtime, config, even more objects. Does it require a reboot? That might be something nice to audit, or even just set up some kind of little monitor we could use. So as you're browsing through this, you're actually going to find additional details that you didn't even think of in your initial requirements gathering that, oh, that'd be really nice to have. So we're going to take this a step further, and we're going to drill down into hardware, since we're looking for like memory and things like that. So when we drill down into hardware, you're actually going to see for vendor and model. Maybe we want to know what type of Dell or HP system this is. In this case, it's just a little white box at home, so it says it needs to be filled in. But then you'll also notice memory size. That looks like it's in bytes. That's not very useful to me. Unless you guys are amazing with math and can do that in your head like that, I would be completely shocked. You'll also see the CPU model. Maybe that'd be useful to have so you know the different CPUs that are in use. Same thing with the CPU megahertz, CPU packages. This is going to be the number of physical CPUs. Your CPU cores, you'll see that I've got a dual core processor in this system. And there's a couple of other details, a number of NICs and things like that. But we still need to find information on if the system's powered on, if the system, what the system name is, and things like that. So let's take a jump back into summary. And let's just keep running down this list. Let's jump into runtime now. So when I jump into the runtime, we're going to see even more details. Now we can see that it's connected. We can see it's powered on. We can see when it was booted. That could be really nice to see if it was booted just recently, that there could potentially be an issue where it crashed and rebooted itself. There's also a couple of other details about the virtual disk capacity. Overall, what we really care about is it's connected, it's powered on. Maybe the boot time. It varies on when you're actually gathering that information if you're running it. But overall, we can go ahead and we can keep kind of just browsing through this and find out other information we want. We can go ahead and see that the status of this box is yellow, and that's because it's unlicensed and it's going to expire tomorrow. I had a good time after reading this, by the way, guys. And we can jump back here. We can actually see that there is the name property, so we know the name, where the name exists. There is tons of other information under hardware. So you can actually dive into hardware. And now this isn't under summary, but it's also hardware, and there's even a little bit different information. Some of it's the same. Depends on where they present the information on what's useful and what you really need. Like I said, kind of just browsing through this API is going to be really useful on finding things that maybe you didn't initially think of during your discovery phase. So let's go ahead, let's jump back into the PowerPoint here. That's my... So the next thing we're going to talk about is we got to write that script now. So let's break this thing down a little bit more thoroughly. I'm running the get-view. Actually, I'm using get-view. I'm specifying the host system managed object. From the host system managed object, I am specifying these properties. The reason I am specifying those properties is I only want that bare minimum information. Where your time saving comes from using views versus using get-vm host or get-vm is from the information it's gathering. If you run get-vm host, it's going to pull down tons of properties and extra information you might not care about, which is why kind of your requirements gathering is really key. Because you're going to save all your time by saying, I only want XYZ properties. And in this case, I only want the name, the summary runtime connection state, the summary runtime power state, summary hardware number of CPU cores, summary hardware CPU megahertz, and summary hardware memory size. Those are the only properties I want. And then I'm piping these to a format table. Now, I'm using a format table there because I'm just going to show it to my console. If you do want to export this to a CSV, you need to use a select object. If you're using a format table or any of the other format commandlets, it's actually changing the object that PowerShell is operating with. And when you export to a CSV, it's going to be all sorts of incorrect information. So use the select object on there if you do want to pipe this to a export CSV. And within there, I'm formatting just the name, so I'm specifying the name property, and then the rest you're going to see these really crazy looking, what they are just hash tables. We've got a hash table with two different keys. We've got the label key and we've got the expression key. What I'm doing is, it's a calculated column is what I'm really creating there. Within that calculated column, we have to specify the label, what we want to call this column name. And then the expression is going to be what the actual value is. For the first few of them, I'm just renaming the column. The reason I'm doing that is I don't want to see summary.runtime.connectionState as my column name. So I'm using a calculated column to kind of just rename what it's actually outputting. But you'll see as you go down lower through this, I'm actually doing some math here a little bit lower. So for the CPU total in gigahertz, so this is my total processing power, I'm getting the CPU in megahertz and dividing it by 1,000 so that it's automatically into gigahertz. And then you'll actually see this is wrapped by another method, which is the math round method. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the value of the first property, or of the first parameter, and then I'm rounding it to the second parameter. So the first decimal place, so you'll see it's 1.6 gigahertz. You'll also see that I've got this math round for hardware memory size, and I'm dividing that by 1 gigabyte. With PowerShell, you can divide by 1 gigabyte, and it's going to know exactly what to divide it by. Since it is in bytes, dividing by 1 gigabyte is going to show it in gigabytes. We've got 16 gigabytes on that system. So let's kind of take a look at VM level performance. Now, when you're taking a look at your VM level performance, you're going to see a couple things you really need to know. There are different stat commandlets that exist. You've got getstat, and this is going to retrieve the statistical information on a vSphere server for each provided entity. So there is a parameter called entity that you can specify, and for every single entity you specify, it's going to return the different statistics that are available. There's also the getstat interval. Now this is an interesting one to look at, so you can actually see how data is, how long it's maintained, how frequently the intervals it takes this data samples are actually when they're taken. And then you've got your getstat type. And this is going to retrieve the available statistic types. So if you don't know exactly what metrics you can gather from a system using getstat, you can run getstat type and specify the same entity, and it'll tell you exactly the different stat types it'll return. So let's actually look at these commandlets a little bit more in depth. We've got getstat, which requires you to input the entity parameter. And it's going to return you things such as the metric ID, the timestamp, the value, the unit, and the instance. And when you run that, it's going to look fairly simple, fairly basic. So you can see against Griffin-mem1 that the different metric IDs, the different values, or the different statistics it has, are listed there. And you're going to see that, okay, so since this is a VM, I can see the CPU usage average, the CPU usage megahertz average, the memory, the network utilization, the system uptime. Not a whole lot of detail, but it's a good start for something you're just querying you're querying vCenter for, and it's giving you the statistic level VM information. Now let's take a look at getstat interval. Now this is going to be a little bit more of a complicated one. It's going to return the name, the sampling period in seconds, and the storage time in seconds. Now, the main thing you want to know about this is what is considered real time to ESX or ESXi is going to be every 20 seconds it samples the current utilization of those statistics. So every 20 seconds is what is considered real time. Now, for the past day interval, what it's going to do is instead of sampling the data every 5 minutes, it's actually going to take that real-time information and it's going to aggregate it up to an average for the last 20 seconds of data. It's going to aggregate that up and kind of average that to be every 5 minutes of data. And it's going to store that for 1 day for you. And the same thing goes for the past week. It's going to aggregate that last all of those 5-minute pieces of information, all of those samples, and it's going to average those into every 30 minutes. And then it's going to store that information for 1 week. So as the time goes on, it's going to re-aggregate the data. You're going to have new data samples. Same thing for past month. It'll take the 30-minute samples, and it'll then put those into 2-hour samples. Store it for 30 days, And then for the past year, you can actually pull information from your VMs. And that's actually going to aggregate the 2-hour samples into every 24-hour sample, so your average utilization for that entire day. And then it's going to store that for 1 year. Anything outside of a year, it's gone. And all this information is going to be stored in your vCenter database. So let's actually take a look at the getStat type. And it's going to require that you provide your entity parameter. It's going to return the different statistic types for the specific entity. So you can see here for Griffin-mem1, there are actually additional details it can pull that were shown by default when I ran the getStat. There are additional, you can also get things, more detailed information about your memory utilization, stuff about your disk utilization. There's other properties that aren't shown by default when you just run getStat. So you can use those in your scripts if you really want to. Now this is going to depend on if you're working with a physical host, if you're working with a VM. You can also run getStat against clusters. So you can gather statistics from all of these different entities and create them into different reports. So in this one, I'm going to go ahead and gather the CPU statistics. On this one, I am doing a bad thing. I'm using getVM. Do not use this in a real script in production. The reason I'm doing it is because I wanted it to all fit on this screen. Simply, I'm using getVM, use the views. Using getView is going to save you a lot of hassle because this is going to take a lot longer to run if I had not run it using getView. And then I'm going to use a where object. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing a little bit of filtering. Again, you want to have your filtering as far to the left as possible. When you run a getView, use the filter parameter there so you're pulling back less information to kind of process later on. Then I'm piping that to a for each object. For each object, I'm going to take this current entity, which that's by default going to return the name of it, and I'm going to pipe it to I'm going to pipe this to a getStat. So I'm going to pipe that VM object to the getStat, and I just want to get a specific statistic. I only want to get the CPU usage average, and I'm specifying the real-time parameter. That real-time parameter is not truly real-time. It's every 20 seconds of data. So it's going to show me every 20 seconds for the last day. There are other parameters that you can use. There is a start parameter, so you can specify a start date, a finish date. There's also max samples if I only want to get the last 10 of the real time. Interval in minutes, interval in seconds. You need to be very mindful of this though, is you cannot query for information that is outside of the scope of one of the stat intervals. So for example, I cannot use the interval in seconds for every 20 seconds for dates that were a week ago, because that information doesn't exist anymore. For a week ago, that information is now every 5-minute intervals. Now it will return information, it's going to return those every 5-minute intervals, just don't be shocked when it's not every 20 seconds. And then when you run that, you're going to see something like this. You'll see that I just pasted that exact same code into PowerShell, and it sent out that information. You'll also see that I am using a format table here. Do not use the format table auto size if you are wanting to put it into a CSV. So let's actually put this into a CSV now. You'll see the script has changed a little bit. I actually changed the functionality of this one. For the most part, it's the same. The major thing I changed is everything is within the for each now. And the reason is because I want different CSVs for every single server I'm querying. So every single VM on my system, or every single VM in my environment that is returned using getVM, is going to go into a for each object. And within that for each object, I'm going to get the same stat type. So I'm specifying the stat of CPU usage average again. And with that CPU usage average, I am going to do real-time information again. Like I said, those other parameters do exist that you can query. Then I'm going to pipe this to a select object. I'm selecting a couple of the details, piping it to a sort object. You don't really need to sort it by entity since it's running for each individual entity. But you need to sort by timestamp, and then export it to a CSV. And when I do that, I'm going to have a whole bunch of CSVs that exist on my file system that have just the same information in it. The really cool thing about dumping it into a CSV is I can open it in Excel and put some really pretty graphs around it that management's going to just eat up. This is one thing I absolutely love about PowerShell. It makes reporting for clients and managers so much easier. When you start generating these really 100-foot views for your managers and for your clients, they're going to be amazed at how well planned you are and how well executed everything is. And that's simply because you took 5 minutes to write a PowerShell script that dumped it to a CSV, took another 2 minutes to create a couple of pretty graphs off of them in Excel, and your job's done. less than 10 minutes, and you won't believe how much that gains with your management and with your clients. We can do the same thing with memory statistics. We're talking about the memory statistics. The only thing I changed in this one is the stat type I'm returning, the memory usage average. And it returns the exact same information. Same thing goes with a memory utilization report. Exact same as a CPU utilization report, except for the stat type is different. And it dumps it out into that. You can put some pretty little graphs around your utilization, maybe a little bit of a, woo, look at how much we spiked at this moment. The management loves that. You can maybe do some trending if you gather it over time. So you dump these all to CSVs. You can do some trending on this without even using a database. Now you're going to have a lot of disk usage you're utilizing by having a bunch of these reports, but you can still do trending. Now there's a couple of additional resources I do want to share with everyone here. The vcheck for vSphere is going to be a really great set of PowerShell scripts that have already been built for you that will actually create HTML reports. Completely free. You can run it against your environment. It's not going to cover every single little detail you could ever imagine, and that's why you need to use the get view with the managed objects to gather the little specific nitpicky information. But if you're just trying to get some very basic stuff, I strongly encourage you to check that out. It doesn't require you writing any kind of reports. It's all built for you. And then also, for the stat interval and the stat type stuff, that can be a little bit confusing when you're trying to understand the whole intervals and how that data aggregates up. There's a really good blog post by Lute. He's a VMware vExpert and PowerShell MVP. It goes into very, very granular details about how stat intervals work, how the data is aggregated up, and he actually links to other blog posts that provide even more in-depth information I would recommend you check out if you really want to get very detailed on the stat intervals. With that being said, what kind of questions do you guys have for me? Yeah?
Do we have a minute to take a look at what kind of visibility we can get with snapshot management, especially what's out there across different hosts?
Let me take a look here. I don't have any snapshots in my lab environment right now, so that no, we can't. If I did, what do you need to do?
Same basic process to build the get view so that I can pull the metrics that
yes, exactly the same. Let me see. We can try to find. I'm going to kind of cheat here. I want to just open up the API reference guide. Like I said, it's super boring, but if you actually look at the
I'm looking for something to replace RV tools for that level of visibility into.
So you're going to see there's a ton of managed objects in here. The main supported ones are listed here. So you can look at your data store level. You can also look at, I believe there's a property on virtual machine that also links to the snapshots. Kind of look through those properties that exist on that. Like I said, I wish I had a snapshot I'd show you.
Sure.
That environment's been running for a few months, and I knew better than to take a snapshot and not touch it. But yeah, just kind of browsing through that, the different API reference guide there. I'm pretty sure there's a property on virtual machine. It's been a while since I've looked at that one, but I'm pretty sure that's where it exists under the virtual machine managed object. And you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, did you ever done any testing if you made some of those get view things a function? Because I mean, essentially you're just writing your own get-vm, right?
Yes.
It's not about making your own.
You can create your own function using that. Completely up to you. At some point, VMware is supposed to be rewriting their modules to be better equipped for large environments. They've been saying that for over a year now. When it's going to come, I don't know. Considering snap-ins are actually a depreciated way of writing for PowerShell, hopefully at some point it will. But you could wrap them in functions and parameterize that function to say, okay, what properties do you want and things like that, just so you don't have to type out that huge command.
Yeah, I didn't know, I mean, does that slow it down at all?
No, I haven't done any testing on that. Maybe a couple milliseconds it'd slow down since it has to wrap it into the function. It wouldn't be as drastic as what the actual get view, get VM host, and stuff like that is. Any other questions?
Curious how these stats may compare to ESX top.
I haven't done any comparisons with that. So I can't say for certain. Overall, it'll vary depending on. You can do the testing. All I did was ran a measure commandlet, and then inside of the script block for the measure command, I just put my content, and it gave you the exact timing on everything. So it's very easy to run. So here we'll actually switch back over to the demonstration. I'll show you how quickly you can actually do this measure command. It's not the system. So it's just a measure dash command, and you specify your input object, I believe it is. It's been a while since I've done this one. Expression. Must be.
Or maybe script block.
I thought it was script block, but that doesn't exist. We'll find out, won't we? Yeah, that's not it. Measure dash. Measure object. I thought it was script block, but it's been a while since I've used this command line now. It's not measure object.
Measure command.
It is measure command. Trying to remember which parameter it is.
Just tap the
Yeah, I tapped through it. It's not input. Maybe it's expression. Let's try. There you go. So you can see that one ran a lot quicker because I've already ran the get-VM commandlet before. So it does cache that a little bit. You'll see it only took 125 milliseconds that time. If I had opened up a completely new PowerShell session and ran it, it would have taken the 12 seconds or whatever to run. Any other questions?
You just run a single ESXi host.
In this lab environment, it's just a single ESXi host. I mostly work with Hyper-V now, so my other machine's dedicated to Hyper-V, my PowerCLI. All right. Well, there is about 15 minutes between the sessions. I'm in here again to talk about SharePoint. If you're really excited about SharePoint too.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Much appreciated. Thank you.